Hello, and welcome to Senior Code Review Buddy. My name is Chris, and today I'm going to talk about how to take a scary code base and make it something that you can commit to without any worries at all. Or at least the first steps in this process. I wanted to share this video because I recently found myself in a lightweight version of this situation. I used ChatGPT to write the beginnings of a chess engine, and the resulting repo was pretty messy. I had ChatGPT write 3 PRs in a row with minimal input from me, and that wasn't a good idea. The problem was that each PR was slightly unstable, and as they built on top of each other, it just became more unstable. Now, it was only 3 PRs, and it was less than 1,000 lines total, so we are talking about a relatively small project. But already, even at the end of those videos, I didn't feel comfortable making changes in that codebase. It just felt very fragile. There were only a handful of tests, and some of them were just failing consistently. In this video, I'm going to walk you through how I got that repo into a much better place with passing tests and code that I feel like I can modify now. To start, I think I've got 4 major concerns that I want to address. First, there's no style format or tooling for this repo, so there's no consistent enforced look to the code. Adding something to enforce a consistent code style shouldn't introduce any issues, as it's just rearranging code that is already present. But I think it'll make it easier for me to read the code, and hopefully make it easier for me to understand it, which is really one of the first things I need to do. So I think getting a consistent style to all the code is a great first step. Second, related to tooling, there isn't a linter. Adding a linter can help automatically surface potential issues or bugs in the code. While I might notice these issues on my own, if I can get tooling that notices them for me, that's a win. It'll help me spend more time on fixing the real issues instead of just trying to figure out if there are any or where they are. Third, this is Python code and it's currently untyped. And I think adding typing can add a lot of value. Like the linter, having typing can help us discover issues, realize we're passing around the wrong type of variables, just sort of make it easier for issues with the code to just be easier to find. And fourth, the tests aren't currently passing. We clearly should fix that. So, how would I suggest approaching all of this? When trying to clean up repos like this, I think there are 2 important guidelines to keep in mind. First, try and break up the changes into small chunks. Make them easy to review, easy to detect if they broke something, and easy to revert if needed. Second, every time you make a change, try and make it impossible for that change to regress. Don't just use linters or typing to find the errors. Make it part of the pre-commit process to prevent new linter or typing errors from getting into the repo. This is really important as we don't want the code base to be able to regress as we're working on it. So let's look at how I broke things down for this repo. All of the pages that I'm looking at will have the links to the GitHub in the description below. Well, one of the first things I did was I marked the currently failing tests as expected failure. And then after this, I added the test suite passing as a check before future changes could get landed. Now, why did I mark these tests as expected failure instead of fixing them? Because it's easier and safer to do that right now. Since these tests are failing right now, I'll need to change some code, maybe in the test, maybe in the non-test code, to get them to pass. And that's going to introduce some risks. And right now, I have so little faith in this code base, I don't want to do anything that feels risky. I will need to do it at some point, but I'd like to try and get things to a better state before doing that. So my first step is by marking these as expected failures. The whole test suite now admits that it is successfully running. And now we can make that a check for new code landing. And this means that our future changes won't accidentally cause a test regression, at least in the sense of our currently passing tests now failing, because we'd catch that with this. So we haven't really improved our code here, but we have helped to ensure it won't get worse. our passing tests will stay passing, and any new tests we add will also have to pass. Next, I added pre-commit, which is a simple but powerful tool to run a couple of various scripts on pre-commit. I started with 3 basic hooks, and there were a few files that made some changes. It's mostly just around white space. There aren't very many of these changes. If we look overall, yeah, it's only like 24 lines changed, so I'm okay with doing this all in one PR. Now, these aren't functional changes at all, but I do think these can help with readability and consistency. We now know that there's not going to be trailing white space, getting us to a more consistent and nice place. Now, what would I do if this was changing a lot of files at once? I'll touch on that in a little more detail when we're dealing with Python typing later on. Now, let's add a tool that can be used as a style formatter and as a linter. Now, I added rough to our pre-commit framework, and we'll run it with just a few rules initially. Now, if we look, there's a lot more lines here changed as opposed to our last PR, but these are all mostly automatic changes from the tooling. There's no functionality change here. You can see, yeah, this is just changing the type of quotes that we use. It's changing the spacing between lines. So it's just making the code more consistent and readable. Now, like I said, I didn't want to do any functionality changes yet, but Rough did complain about a couple of things that it couldn't automatically fix. How did I handle those? Pretty simple. Just added a no QA and basically just told Rough, ignore this for now. Don't worry about this. These are issues that I'm going to have to fix eventually, but I'd rather not do them at the same time that there's all these other automatic changes happening. They might require a little bit of thinking, so I'd rather sort of do that by itself. But I also don't want Rough to ignore these types of errors overall, because I could then accidentally introduce them myself in other PRs. So it's better to sort of on a line-by-line basis, for any cases that are generating these errors, explicitly ignore them. So the file overall gets the coverage, but you don't have to fix those errors yet. So once again, it'll help our future PRs be a little better. Now it's time to add our first Python typing, which we'll use MyPy and just run the basic version. And as you can see, it really doesn't do much. There is just one line that I added an ignore. So once again, it's pretty basic. We're ignoring an existing error. No functionality changes. It's just the start, but it's going to help us avoid some regressions in the future. So this is a good place to go for now. So at this point, we've not had to really think too much, but I think we've got the repo in a better place already. We've got a style formatter, basic linter, basic typing, and we're running tests as part of the commit process. So if we add any new code, it'll probably be at a higher quality than what we've already got there, as it will need to pass all of the tooling that we've had. It's important to note at this point, though, that we've not really introduced any functionality changes. It should be running the same as before, which means all of the bugs that we had before still are going to be there. We've just introduced tooling to make the code easier to read, and which will identify any new issues we might accidentally introduce in future PRs. So at this point, I took a brief detour to start making some functionality changes to the repo. Currently, in all the dealings with the chessboard, the code refers to the columns and rows by zero-based index values. So a square is something like 0, 1, 1, 0, 4, 5, and so on. But if you've played chess before, you likely know that there is a well-known system to refer to the squares, algebraic notation. And I figured that it would be much easier to use algebraic notation in the codebase, because to be honest, at a glance, I don't know what square 3, 4 refers to, but I do know what square d4 is. So I had ChatGPT write a square class that worked with algebraic notation, and I got it to pass all of the checks that we already have. So I think it probably was slightly better code than some of the other code we had in there. Now, why did I make this change to add a new class instead of fixing all of the issues that we've already identified in the repo? because I viewed this as part of fixing the repo. Some of the upcoming changes are going to involve dealing with square positions. And I think it's going to be much easier for me to grasp my head around things and make it work if the square code is there and easy to work with, as opposed to having to figure out like, okay, 3, 4, is it row first or column first? So I think this is a good prerequisite thing that we've worked on. Now things get a bit tricky. Now it is time to start making some of the bigger changes in the repo. I decided at this point the first thing I want to do is get typing added to all of the repo. So what's the best approach to do that? One idea is that I could pick a file, add some of the missing typing to it, and just slowly work through the repo that way. A problem with this approach, going back to one of my guidelines, is it doesn't do anything to prevent regression. If I go to a file and add all of the missing typing, there's nothing to prevent me from going back there later and accidentally adding some new untyped code. So what can we do to make these changes and also make sure we don't accidentally regress? Well, what we will do is we will add a new pre-commit step. It's going to be another copy of MyPy, but this time we're going to run it in strict mode, which will require full typing. But then, how do I avoid this being a big PR? I just exclude every single file that generated an error in strict mode. So with this here, if a new file is added, it's going to have all the typing right away, which is good. And if there was a file that has full typing already and isn't listed here, it will also have to stay at full typing. But now, what do we do with these files here? What we are going to do is we'll slowly work through this list of excluded files. We'll remove a file or two at a time from this list, fix all of the errors related to it, just like we're doing here, and then we'll land it. And it's just at that point, rinse and repeat until we've gotten them all removed. Now, sort of as mentioned, like once we've done this, we're not going to have any new issues enter these files. I do try to make these changes when I'm doing them as sort of simple as possible. So at this point, I'm just adding typing checks. If you get to something that you realize, oh, this is an error, oh, this code should be handled in a different way, try not to put it in with these kind of changes. Instead, try to have it sort of by itself. So maybe start by ignoring the error and then follow up in a PR where you fix the error, or fix it first and then enable strict typing for it. Sort of whatever you feel more comfortable with, but don't try to have a change where you're just, kind of adding very simple to understand typing with one where you're also, okay, I'm doing some logical change here and this is now a functionality change. We really want to keep functional changes and sort of non-functional changes apart. It just makes it easier to review stuff. So now we are on the final change, which will run MyPy in strict mode for all files. So there was one last file that we had to do. So we did that file. And then at the same time, I also removed the old version of just running MyPy in non-strict mode, because now that we're running it in strict mode for every file, we don't need this non-strict one. And with that, I'm down to sort of two last PRs that I want to show you, both based around tests. So this is the first test that I fixed in Chess Engine Test. And if you look at it, you can see, yep, I only changed the test file. So the problem here wasn't an issue with the non-test code per se. Instead, it was just the test setup wasn't great. I had kind of misunderstood something in how I was setting stuff up here. So I was able to clean up the test setup, get the test to actually run as it should be, and we got a green test, and we were able to remove this expected failure. And with this, we were down to just one file with tests failing that we should fix, and let's go take a look at that now. And here we are, the last file that fixed our tests. And the first thing you can maybe notice is that the first file we've got here, it's not a test file. So there was an actual bug here that I needed to fix. The tests were failing because there was an error in our code. So if we go down, it's in this section around with, generate sliding moves. So basically how this code worked is for bishops, queens, and rooks, because they can sort of slide and do multiple moves, we have this function that dealt with them. And basically, you go in a direction, and while you're still on the board, you check to see if it's an empty square or if the piece is capturable by you. And in that situation, that's a position you can move to. So you append it, and then you break, which means that at most you could only ever slide one square in any direction. So that's what the bug here was. Now, the worst part about this, when I looked at this code as I was trying to clean it up, I realized that I introduced this bug. In the original code generated by ChatGPT, it did have these as two separate conditions. And I remember looking at it and thinking they were basically the same condition and being like, oh yeah, I can just do this in one thing, and I merged them. Now the code was tested, but the tests were failing because, similar to my last PR we fixed, the test setup was wrong. So I introduced this error, and the tests were failing now for a new reason, but there was no state change because they'd been failing before. So I didn't realize that I introduced this bug. But with this change here, I was able to fix the functions, and we were able to remove the expected failure. And with this, we got to the state of all the tests that are in the repo are now passing. So there you go. We've got the repo in a much better state now than before. Although there are still issues. The repo could use more tests, and there's still the ignored linter and typing errors that need to be fixed. But it's at a place where now I feel I could go in and, with some degree of confidence, make changes, because I know there is testing, there is a linter, there is typing in most places, so it feels safer to work there. I hope this gives you the confidence to start improving any scary code bases you're working with. The process does take time, but you can get that repo into shape. And even just one of the steps I've talked about today can really pay off dividends. Remember, it's not necessary that every PR improves your repo. Sometimes just adding stuff to make sure you can't regress on certain things is a good starting point. If you have any advice on how you would make a scary repo less scary to work with, please let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button below and subscribing. If you have any comments, code you'd like me to review, or ideas you'd like me to talk about, please leave a comment below, or reach me at chris@seniorcodereviewbuddy.com. Thanks, and have a great day.